To go over increasing or decreasing exposure using the 15% rule again. I don't think anyone is having a lot of trouble with the increasing the exposure using the 15% rule. However, with decreasing the exposure using the 15% rule, there was two questions on the bottom of our kVp in-class activity where it said to decrease 50% and decrease 100. And that is what I want to go over with you because we really aren't decreasing our exposure by 100%. So we need to go over that to clarify. So first I'm going to go over examples of increasing the exposure using the 15% rule. And this one is keeping the overall exposure the same. So we have a technique of 56 kVp at 6 mass. We want to increase our kVp by 15%, so we're going to take 56 times 1.15 to get 64 kVp. Since we are increasing our kVp, in order to keep our overall exposure the same, we have to then half our mass. So we're going to take our 6 mass divided by 2, and we get 3 mass. So our new technique, keeping overall exposure the same, would be 64 at 3. And I think everyone is good here. Then we look at using the 15% rule to increase the exposure by 100%. So if we're starting with the technique of 60 kVp at 10 mass, we're again going to increase that kVp by 15%. So we're going to take 60 times 1.15 to come up with a new kVp of 69. Now remember, this time we are just increasing our exposure, so we are only going to adjust the kVp. We're going to keep the mass the same. So our new technique would be 69 kVp at 10 mass. Here we're going to use the 15% rule to increase the exposure by 200%. So we're starting with a technique of 65 kVp at 5 mass. Again, remember, we're just changing the kVp. Okay, so we're going to look at the 65 times that by 1.15 to come up with a new kVp of 74.5. Now at this step, that is taking our exposure up to 100%. So now if we take the answer we got there, the 74.75, times it again by 1.15, we come up with a new kVp of 86. This is where we then increased our exposure by 200%. So our mass is going to stay the same, and our new technique would be 86 at 5 mass. So again, remember, when we multiply the 65 times 1.15, we are increasing the exposure by 100%. If we then multiply our answer again by 1.15, we are increasing our exposure by 200%. This is another example that we went through in class, and this is using the 15% rule to increase our exposure by 50%. So starting with a kVp of 60, what new kVp would result in 50% more exposure? So again, we want 50% instead of 100, so we're going to use half of the 15%, which would be 7.5%. We take the 60 kVp times 7.5%, and we come up with 4.5. Then we'll take the 60 plus the 4.5 for a new kVp of 64.5. Another way that you can do this is to take 60 times 1.075, and it would automatically come up with the 64.5. Whichever way is easiest for you to understand and do, please do it the way you're more comfortable. Again, remember, when we are increasing our exposure by 50%, we are only using half of the 15% rule. So this is where it got confusing, and I'm apologizing for that. So on our worksheet, we did have, using the 15% rule, adjust the exposure by decreasing 50%. What we need to understand is that when we're decreasing our exposure using the 15% rule, we are decreasing our exposure by 50%. So here, if we have a kVp of 120, what new kVp would result in 1/2 or 50% the exposure? We're going to take 120 kVp times 0.85, and our new kVp would be 102. So using a 102 kVp would be half or 50% of the original exposure. The last one we want to do here is using the 15% rule to decrease the exposure by 75%. On the worksheet it had decreased 100%. However, we do not do that. If you look at page 254 in your textbook, good information there to read over. Also, after we're done with this slide here, you can go to page 254 and do exercise 16.1. There's 8 different questions there that you can do on your own, and the questions are in the back of your textbook, so this would be a very good review for you to do. So here again, we want to keep our mass the same. If we reduce the overall exposure by half 2 times, we would be decreasing our exposure by 75%. This would result in 1/4 of the original exposure. So let's look at the first example. If we started with a kVp of 90, we would do the following. We're going to take 90 times 0.85 to come up with a kVp of 76.5. This has decreased our exposure by 50%. Then we're going to take that 76.5 times 0.85, and we have a new kVp of 65. Okay, so this is decreasing our exposure by 75%. So the new kVp here would be 65. Another example, if we started with a kVp of 70, we would take that 70 times 0.85 to come up with a new kVp of 60. Again, we've decreased our exposure by 50%, and then we're going to take that 60 times 0.85, and we're going to get a new kVp of 51, and that is taking our exposure, decreasing our exposure by 75%. Please reach out to me if you have any concerns or questions. We will be going over this in a review for your test, and we will do some more problems together so that you are totally familiar with what to do with any questions that may come up.